The earth trembles. A fine, dry dust rises slowly into the scorching air, even before the first dark silhouettes take shape on the horizon. This is no sudden natural cataclysm. It is the inexorable advance of the ultimate war machine, cold-bloodedly erasing national borders and swallowing entire peoples in its ruthless, mechanical wake. By the end of the summer of 480 BC, the thick dust from the endless march of the colossal Persian army has completely choked the sky over a fractured, terrified Hellas. Hundreds of thousands of boots methodically grind the stony roads into fine sand. An innumerable host, like an all-consuming dark ocean, rolls southward. They aren't just marching, they are reshaping the very landscape. Their military engineers arrogantly cut wide canals through solid peninsulas and throw giant pontoon bridges across turbulent straits, literally binding continents with chains. The empire brooks no obstacles. And here, from the very first moments, a mind-numbing tactical riddle arises. Why is this ruthless, giant horde, capable of easily bypassing and crushing any resistance in open terrain, purposefully drawing itself into an incredibly narrow, dead-end gorge? Why voluntarily strip themselves of their primary, absolute strategic advantage, maneuverability? And an even more frightening historical anomaly. Why does Sparta, the most paranoically militarized polis of antiquity, send against this giant Persian juggernaut not its celebrated invincible army, but only a microscopic, pathetic escort? Greece is paralyzed by primal fear and petty political infighting. The Hellenic world has frozen in oppressive anticipation of the looming catastrophe. In the squares, bureaucrats argue themselves hoarse, trying to save their fortunes. Politicians greedily divide the vanishing crumbs of influence, while the world around them rapidly collapses. In Athens, orators compete in empty eloquence, while in the south, they cowardly erect pathetic defensive fortifications, hoping to hide behind others' backs. Priests, with an air of extreme importance, read the steaming entrails of slaughtered sacrificial animals, clinging to any religious pretext, no matter how absurd, to delay the inevitable clash. While the Spartan priests stalled for time, cynically hiding behind sacred festivals, a fatal storm was already brewing in the north. King Leonidas harbors no illusions. He is not the weary, noble elder of myth, dispensing wise philosophical advice. He is a pragmatic, cynical, and bone-hard commander. He is leading his tiny personal detachment to a cold, flawlessly calculated suicide under the convenient diplomatic pretext of a routine reconnaissance mission. Officially, they are going simply to assess the situation on the northern border. In reality, it is a high-priced one-way ticket. 300 Spartans, 300 grown men who already have sons at home, ensuring their warrior lineages do not end. These are not naive, glory-seeking boys. This is the cold-blooded elite of the ancient world. What would you feel, standing shoulder to shoulder with these doomed men, when the very earth vibrates continuously from the synchronized steps of hundreds of thousands of your enemies? Could you voluntarily give up your only life, your family, for an abstract state law, knowing in advance that your personal sacrifice is mathematically insignificant in the scale of this global war? Who is the real barbarian here? The Persian king, blinded by imperial hubris and convinced that any idea can be bought with gold? Or these few, sullen defenders who indifferently abandoned their children for a blind, fanatical devotion to brutal rules? The air smelled of sulfur and the copper tang of blood. There were no grandiose, tearful speeches before the ranks, no humiliating trembling of the knees. Only the sharp, mechanical, rhythmic thud of heavy sandals against the stony soil. Strike. Pause. Strike. The Spartans march. Their stride is perfectly even. Their hands do not shake from fatigue. They carry within them the very idea of uncompromising devotion to the law, a law that demands total, terrifying self-abnegation. After several days of exhausting, non-stop marching, the tension in the ranks reaches its breaking point. The fragile illusion of control shatters. Scouts return to camp, their faces white with primal horror. There aren't just thousands or tens of thousands of Persians. Their heavy legions literally drink deep rivers dry. A new, will-paralyzing factor suddenly hits the morale of the Greek vanguard. A giant enemy fleet, like a black, ominous shadow, glides along the coastline, severing any ghost of hope for help from the sea. Every new report wounds deeper than a poisoned arrow. A tangible threat of immediate mutiny arises. The fear of the crowd is contagious. 7,000 allied infantrymen, who joined the Spartans along the way, are ready at any moment to break the line and flee in disgrace. An error in assessing the allies' morale could cost Leonidas everything. If they break now, the Spartans will find themselves alone on an open road, where the imperial death conveyor will dispose of them in minutes. The camera catches, for a brief moment, the sweat and grime-streaked face of an anonymous Arcadian hoplite. He is gasping, wheezing from the thick road dust. His fingers, white with tension, grip the smooth shaft of his long spear until they crack, his eyes unnaturally dilated by the crystal-clear realization of his imminent end. He looks at the Spartans marching beside him with naked terror, and he sees not a single drop of fear in them. The Spartans do not slacken their pace for a second. Their icy, almost psychopathic resolve instantly infects the wavering allies, making them burn with shame for their own panic. This is a head-on collision of two incompatible scales. The giant, faceless, bureaucratic mechanism of the Eastern Empire against a tiny handful of professional killers, voluntarily walking into an open grave. The Persians spent years building massive fleets to carry slavery across the world, while the Spartans went to build solid walls out of their own bodies to hold on to freedom. Both will very soon drown in large-scale violence. Step by step, they push further north. Freedom, born in filth and rot, is only just beginning to take shape in their minds as a vague, distant concept. Right now, it is just a hard, non-negotiable order, an inevitable, heavy duty. The shadows from the overhanging cliffs grow longer and thicker. The narrow coastal strip rapidly shrinks, ruthlessly squeezing the doomed warriors between sheer slopes and the restless, dark sea. The cold stones of Thermopylae become silent witnesses to their preparation for death. From these cold stones, a rhythmic, dry thud now echoes. This is not the nervous clattering of weapons before a battle. It is cold engineering calculation. While the massive Persian horde slowly spills across the plain, pitching its innumerable multicolored camp, the Greeks masterfully turn geography into their primary ally. By the end of August 480 BC, the sun is ruthlessly scorching the last of the moisture from the soil. The gorge of the fire gates is a unique trap, created by nature itself. To the right loom the near-vertical, inaccessible slopes of Mount Calidromus, densely overgrown with thorny brush. To the left hisses the treacherous coastline of the Malian Gulf, dropping straight into the water. At its narrowest point, the width of the passage is a measly 15 meters. With one surgically precise tactical decision, the Spartans negate the entire logistics of global war. They take the Empire's ultimate advantage, its endless human resources, and cynically turn it into a fatal weakness. In this cramped stone corridor, a 1,000,000-man army loses all meaning. There is no room for complex flanking maneuvers. There is nowhere for heavy cavalry to deploy. Here, Only the mass of bronze and the ability to take a hit per square meter decide the outcome. In the center of the gorge stands the old, half-ruined Phocian wall. Work begins. Without shouting, without fuss, and with terrifying mechanical efficiency, the hoplites restore the stonework. They aren't building a fortress for a long-term siege. They are constructing a funnel. A death chute into which the Imperial infantry must inevitably flow. Every stone laid narrows the space, forcing the enemy to concentrate more densely before the impenetrable front of Spartan shields. Imagine yourself in the place of an elite Persian scout. You cautiously crawl to the edge of a rocky cliff, wiping clammy sweat from your forehead. You expect to see soldiers exhausted by the march, paralyzed by animal fear of the God King's power. You expect panic. But below reigns a blood-chilling serenity. Men doomed to certain death do not pray for a miracle. They are calmly practicing gymnastics. They sit on heated stones and methodically comb their long hair, rubbing expensive oil into it. To the Eastern mind, this looks like an insulting absurdity. But in Spartan philosophy, this is the ultimate stage of readiness. This is how a warrior puts himself in order before stepping forever into the void. They have already crossed the invisible line. They have buried themselves alive, leaving everything worldly behind. And that is exactly what makes them psychologically bulletproof. How can you intimidate those who have already accepted their death as an absolute, accomplished fact? But every tactical scheme, even the most perfect, has a blind spot. Local residents, trembling with fear, point out the fatal vulnerability of the gorge to Leonidas. Anopeia. A hidden mountain route snaking through dense oak forests, allowing one to stealthily bypass the fire gates from the rear. This is a critical, maddening risk. If the enemy finds this thin thread, the stone trap will snap shut on the defenders. The situation demands immediate action. Leonidas is forced to make an extremely dangerous compromise. He detaches 1,000 Phocian militiamen from his already microscopic forces and sends them into the mountains to guard this invisible breach. Dividing an army in the face of an enemy thousands of times superior is a tactical tightrope walk over an abyss. The fate of the entire operation now hangs on a thin thread of trust in allies hidden in the thick fog of the high country. Meanwhile, Xerxes, the lord of Asia, simply waits. For 4 long days, his giant army stands in camp, consuming a monstrous amount of resources. Scouts bring him ridiculous reports of doomed men combing their hair. The God King sincerely does not understand what is happening. In his reality, entire nations fall to their knees at the mere sound of his name. He is absolutely certain that this pathetic provincial performance will end as soon as the Hellenes' nerves give out, that the primal instinct for self-preservation will force them to drop their heavy weapons and flee in disgrace. But empires always stumble not over high mountains, but over people who have nothing left to lose. The silence in the gorge grows thick, almost tangible. The Spartans complete their grim rituals. Heavy, round shields are polished to a blinding shine. Long spears are leveled. Each warrior takes his place, merging seamlessly with his neighbor into a single, monolithic bronze organism. The trap is set. The Persian ruler expected submission, but received only arrogant silence. Diplomacy comes to an end, giving way to the cold, mathematical logic of total annihilation. This cold, mathematical logic of total annihilation begins with a short dialogue. The Lord of Asia sends a final negotiator. The ultimatum is simple. Lay down your arms, and your lives will be spared. King Leonidas's response cuts into history like a dull razor blade across raw nerves. Come and take them. This is not teenage bravado for the sake of a clever phrase. This is the conscious, cold activation of a ruthless death machine. The diplomatic deadlock is finally broken. The echo of this short command hasn't even dissolved in the morning air before the earth begins to tremble again. Xerxes loses his patience. He unleashes the first wave of his shock troops, the Medes. Fierce conquerors of the East, hardened in endless wars, they rush forward with a deafening, furious roar. They are confident in a quick and easy victory. The empire is used to breaking the enemy's will with its overwhelming appearance alone. But here, an insurmountable, paralyzing physical shock awaits them. What would you feel, standing in the front ranks of the phalanx, when a wall of flesh, blinded by primal rage, rushes at you at full speed? The Spartans felt nothing. Their line closed with a dull, heavy metallic clang. A solid line of round, heavy bronze shields locked down the narrow space from the sheer cliff to the sea. From behind the edge of the polished bronze, a thick forest of long, lethal spears instantly bristled. Collision. The impact of the first wave against the Greek defensive line was like a massive ship shattering against an impregnable reef. The deafening screech of mangled metal instantly drowned out the screams of thousands. The shock of the first physical contact paralyzed the attackers. The Medes suddenly realized their absolute vulnerability. Armed only with short spears and light wicker shields, their protective gear was useless here. Their colossal numerical superiority instantly evaporated in the cramped confines of the narrow passage. Imagine yourself in the place of a Persian infantryman in this hell. You are being relentlessly crushed from behind by the uncontrollable, blind mass of your own comrades. You cannot take a step back. You cannot dodge to the side. Before you stands a faceless, utterly indifferent bronze wall. From this wall, with surgical precision, heavy metal blades fly out monotonically and inevitably. The trap has snapped shut. The Spartans did not fight in a state of nervous frenzy. They were simply performing heavy physical labor. It was a routine, methodical disposal of enemy manpower. A hard thrust, a quick recovery, a synchronized step forward. Discipline emotionlessly and methodically ground down the mass. The death conveyor began operating at full capacity. Cold bronze dealt hundreds of fatal blows per minute. No chance for a miraculous escape. The air in the gorge rapidly thickened with kicked-up dust and the heavy smell of copper. In this strange, asymmetric conflict, the grim truth of ancient warfare was revealed. A massive crowd means absolutely nothing if it cannot apply its force at a single point. Persian overseers ruthlessly drove men forward under the brutal lashes of long whips. The rear ranks of the army inexorably pushed the front ranks directly onto the leveled Spartan points. The price that ordinary soldiers paid for their king's exorbitant ambitions grew with every second. The gorge rapidly filled with the fallen. The landscape was transforming into an impassable, horrific barrier for the attackers themselves. There is no room here for noble chivalry. This is mechanical, industrial violence. The Spartan machine functioned flawlessly, expending the energy of its soldiers with maximum economy. The Greeks did not kill out of personal hatred. They killed out of harsh tactical necessity. Every thrust of a spear was calculated to the centimeter. Every synchronized movement of a heavy shield beat back the helpless, chaotic attacks of the enemy with a terrifying, inhuman calm. Xerxes watched this unfolding nightmare from his high throne. His habitual self-assurance developed a deep crack. Imperial hubris was slowly replaced by a chilling lack of comprehension. How can an empire that conquered half the known world break so helplessly against a few hundred stubborn men? A hero to some is always a butcher to others. The elite of the East were dying not in a fair duel between equal opponents, but in a well-engineered tactical meat grinder. The Spartans taught the ruler of half the world a brutal lesson in geometry. A narrow stone corridor, plus a long, heavy spear, always equals infinite losses for the attacking side. The first day of this non-stop slaughter was nearing its end. Endless waves of Eastern shock troops crashed against the phalanx, one after another. Each new wave shattered with the same fatal result. Physical fatigue accumulated in the defenders' muscles, but their formation remained monolithic. The illusion of a quick, ceremonial Persian victory vanished. In its place came a heavy, paralyzing fear. The great empire began to choke on its own unmanageable mass. The East thought it was going to punish a small bunch of frightened rebels. Instead, they stepped straight into the steel jaws of a perfect mechanism. The Persians drove massive fleets west to bind foreign lands with chains, but those ambitions broke against a wall of flawless human discipline. Both sides found themselves locked together in a cramped space, and this tactical stalemate forced the defenders to take an incredible risk, creating an absolute illusion of their own weakness. This absolute illusion of weakness became the most elegant and simultaneously most brutal tactical deception of the first day. The sun rolled heavily behind the darkened mountain peaks, staining the waters of the Malian Gulf a deep crimson. By the end of the day, the landscape had changed beyond recognition. Piles of broken weapons and fallen soldiers physically hindered movement for both sides. Persian officers lost their voices and fell into a dull, paralyzing despair. Their endless, blind waves of attackers simply dissolved in the invisible shredder. And then, the Spartans do something completely unthinkable. They consciously break their perfect, impenetrable formation. At an invisible signal, the monolithic bronze wall suddenly wavers. Heavy shields are lowered clumsily. The Greeks, with shouts strikingly similar to genuine panic, abruptly turn their backs to the stunned enemy and bolt, running deep into the narrowing stone corridor. Could you, commanding a bloodied and humiliated army, resist that sweet, intoxicating temptation? The Persians failed this psychological test. They saw the defenseless backs of those who, only a minute ago, seemed like invulnerable demons of war. Blind fury, magnified by a savage, uncontrollable urge to avenge a humiliating, hours-long slaughter, completely overrode their reason. The Eastern infantry surged forward with a triumphant howl, finally shattering their own already shaky ranks. They threw themselves into a chaotic pursuit, stretching out in a long, disorganized chain along the stone walls of the gorge. The camera catches the face of a young median commander for a second in the very center of this frenzied attack. His lungs burn like fire from greedy gulps of dusty, iron-scented air. His eyes gleam with madness in anticipation of an easy execution of a broken, cowardly, fleeing enemy. He feels victory is within reach. He fails to understand one thing. He is not pursuing frightened men, but brilliant, ruthless choreographers of death. And then, the trap snapped shut with a deafening crack. At a single, short, sharp note from the Spartan flutes, the fleeing Hellenes stopped as if by magic. No fatigue, no panic. This was a cold-blooded, lethal ballet, rehearsed through decades of grueling training. With absolute synchronicity, the Spartans pivoted 180 degrees. Their polished shields slammed shut again with a dull thud. In the place of a fleeing crowd, an impenetrable wall of bronze and sharp spears rose in a single second right in front of the faces of the breathless pursuers. The Persians, having lost their formation, overextended and panting, slammed full tilt into this resurrected monolith.
The vector of the attack shifted instantly. The hunters became helpless victims in their own trap. The methodical, almost clinical disposal of the deceived mob began. This no longer looked like a clash between two armies. It resembled an organized industrial harvest. The Greeks struck with surgical cynicism. A short thrust of a Spartan sword into an unprotected face. A step forward, a blow with the rim of the shield. Another step. The Spartans weren't just surviving this battle. They completely controlled the rhythm of someone else's agony. Every strike was mathematically calibrated to the millimeter. The Persians tried to retreat in terror, but the rear ranks of their own army, blinded by the false illusion of victory, continued to press forward furiously. They shoved their own brothers in arms directly onto the leveled Spartan points. The trap became absolutely airtight. The horror of this tactical scheme lay in its inevitability and cold calculation. The collision of the blind rage of a massive empire and the icy, psychopathic control of a tiny detachment produced a monstrous result. The attackers suffocated in a deadly crush, stepping over their own dead, while the defenders breathed steadily and calmly, conserving every drop of energy. No rage, only the cold professionalism of executioners. Does the defense of a homeland justify such calculated, almost machine-like cruelty? Who is the greater monster here? The king driving slaves to the slaughter, or the warriors who turned killing into a precise science? By the time thick night descended upon the gorge, the imperial forces' losses were counted in the thousands. The grand plan for a lightning-fast world conquest had tripped over the dusty boot of a Spartan infantryman. An army of submissive slaves will always lose to an army of free-willed radicals, provided those radicals fight like perfectly tuned mechanisms. Xerxes watched from his high throne with chilling horror as the pathetic remnants of his regular infantry retreated in panic to the camp. The ordinary troops of the East had proved utterly useless for cracking this Greek tin can. Their morale was completely annihilated in one short day. But the enraged ruler of half the world still had one last, ultimate ace up his sleeve. The pride of the empire demanded immediate, exemplary revenge. In the deep silence of the falling night, Xerxes prepared his alpha predators to take the stage. The dawn of the second day brought no dawn of hope. The air in the stone sack of Thermopylae became thick and heavy, saturated with acrid dust and the sickeningly sweet smell of the flesh processed the day before. The Lord of Asia could no longer afford to play at imperial magnanimity. Humiliated and burning with blind rage, Xerxes made his strongest, ultimate move. He released those very alpha predators onto the stage. The God King's personal guard entered the fray. 10,000 absolutely perfect killing machines. They were called the Immortals. They were the elite of the elite, whose reputation far outpaced their footsteps. They had never lost. They knew no doubt, and their number was always maintained at exactly 10,000 soldiers. If one fell, another immediately took his place, creating a terrifying illusion of absolute invulnerability in the enemy's ranks. They advanced in complete, ominous silence. No primal roar like yesterday's shock troops. Only the rhythmic rustle of expensive fabrics, a heavy tread, and the ring of the finest steel in the ancient world. This was a head-on collision between two radically opposed military philosophies. On one side stood the elegant, flawless aesthetic of imperial executioners, accustomed to masterfully dancing with weapons across the vast expanses of the plains. On the other was the raw, pragmatic cruelty of a Spartan square made of heavy oak and cast bronze. Who would emerge the victor? The absolute grace of imperial form, or concentrated, animalistic, defensive utility? Did their supreme elite status justify the blind pride with which they voluntarily stepped into this deadly stone corridor? The camera briefly inhabits one of the immortal guardsmen. You are used to the enemy breaking and running at the mere sight of your magnificent presence. Your light shield of tightly woven wicker and your short, maneuverable spear are perfect for dynamic, open combat. But there is no dynamics here. You take a synchronized step forward and suddenly hit an absolutely dead wall of foreign shields. Your elegant weapons simply cannot reach the opponent. You strike the finest steel of the East against a solid piece of Greek armor, leaving only pathetic scratches on the polished surface. And then, from behind that wall, a long Spartan spear flies out with incredible force and speed. Perfect calculation. Impact. Lights out. The elite's elegant fighting style began to rapidly suffocate in the stifling claustrophobia of the gorge. Their famous light shields were instantly smashed to splinters under the crushing, heavy blows of the hoplites. What was supposed to be a beautiful, triumphant march of the king's personal guard turned into a methodical, monstrous butchery within minutes. The perfect Eastern killing machines suddenly realized with chilling horror that they had met unmatched engineers of death. The Spartans surpassed them in everything. Their colossal advantage in heavy equipment was multiplied by an inhuman, almost machine-like endurance. The Greeks didn't get tired. They worked. Without hysterics, without blind rage, they simply and dryly met their quota for human disposal in the conditions of a strictly confined space. And here, in the midst of this utter hell, a new, maddening factor arose, completely changing the rules of the game. Equipment failure. The Spartan spears made of sturdy ash began to break en masse from the continuous, heavy blows against the guardsmen's armor. It seemed like a chance for the Empire. But the Hellenes, without flinching a single muscle, cold-bloodedly cast aside the useless shafts and drew their short, broad swords. The radius of the kill zone shrank. The density of contact increased to the absolute limit. The pressure from the rear ranks of the Immortals became their primary, fatal curse. The elite of the Persian army were literally pressed into Spartan blades by their own comrades, leaving no chance for maneuver or retreat. This was no longer a battle. It was a ruthless, industrial press. Could you keep your sanity, realizing that your elite status is worth absolutely nothing here, while your own commander continues to methodically hammer you into this meat grinder? Xerxes, watching this nightmare, leaped from his high golden throne 3 times. His habitual anger was replaced by a helpless, cold terror. The best sons of his colossal empire, those who for long years had brought him the severed heads of kings, were now fertilizing the stony soil of a foreign, unwelcoming land en masse. The empire was watching its own humiliating public beating in real time. Every broken blade of an immortal was a heavy blow to the flawless reputation of the invincible god on earth. The beautiful myth of their immortality was ruthlessly crushed by dry, cynical Spartan pragmatism. For centuries, the Persians had built luxurious palaces and cherished their elite to demonstrate status to the world. But in one day, the Spartans reduced that elite to the level of ordinary, unremarkable ballast at the bottom of a narrow gorge. The second day of the endless battle ended in a catastrophic, total failure for the East. The vaunted Immortals, having lost a giant portion of their strength and failing to move the bronze front by even a single meter, were forced to retreat in disgrace. They left behind only mountains of shiny but now completely useless equipment. The Spartans stood in the exact same spot. Their heavy shields were covered in deep dents.
The bronze was hidden under a thick layer of acrid dust and caked filth, and their hands shook from incredible physical strain. But the monolithic formation remained unbroken. They had vividly proven that iron discipline is capable of grinding down any elite status. However, every defensive line, even the most impregnable, has one hidden flaw that is completely impossible to cover with thick shields or sharp spears. That flaw is human nature. While the bloodied Greeks, staying on their feet solely through the remnants of adrenaline, tried to catch their breath under the cover of descending darkness, suffocating from the stench of corpses, a treacherous plan was already ripening behind their backs. A plan dictated not by tactical genius or courage, but by a base stab in the back under the cover of night. This betrayal had a very specific, human face, a face that would forever lose its excuses and become a synonym for absolute, sickening treachery. His name was Ephialtes, a local resident blinded not by a great ideology, nor by animal fear of an invincible army, but by banal, low greed. While the bloodied Greeks, holding their ground only through burnt-out adrenaline, were recovering their strength in the pitch black, suffocating from the thick stench of death, the dirtiest deal of antiquity was being struck in the luxurious tent of the Lord of Asia. For a pathetic handful of silver coins, for ghostly promises of regional power, this man cold-bloodedly, without a single shadow of a doubt, sold out the fate of an entire nation. What is ironclad loyalty to a harsh law worth when immediate personal gain is placed on the scales? Could you resist the devilish temptation to become the wealthiest ruler of a province in exchange for just one short phrase, quietly dropped into the ear of an enemy general? Ephialtes could. He volunteered to be the guide to hell. Heroism on the front lines is always vulnerable to rats in the deep rear. The Spartans were erecting an indestructible wall of their own lives to deadlock the pass, but the traitor simply opened the black back door for the enemy. The commander of the elite guard, Hydarnes, did not waste a single precious second. Under the cover of ominous nocturnal gloom, as the pale moon cowered behind heavy clouds, a column of Persian executioners moved silently into the mountains. The secret mountain path of Anapeia twisted through thick, damp oak forests. This was not the proud march of invincible conquerors. This was death itself, crawling. The dynamics of fierce combat were abruptly replaced by the frightening silence of a stealthy night crossing. No treacherous clanking of metal. All elements of equipment were tightly wrapped in dark cloth. Short orders were given exclusively in unintelligible whispers. Only the steady, rhythmic crunch of thousands of dry oak leaves under the soft leather boots of the killers could be heard. The camera briefly inhabits one of the Phocian militiamen left by King Leonidas to guard this secret high-altitude route. You are sitting by a dying fire on a wind-swept mountain peak. You are shivering from the piercing night cold. Below, in the gorge, doom has been sleeping for 2 days. You are absolutely certain that you are in complete safety at this god-forsaken height. Your only task is simply to watch. Suddenly, the dull, oppressive silence is cut by a strange, unnatural rustle. It grows. It inexorably fills all the space around you. You peer into the inky darkness, and suddenly realize with chilling horror that the darkness itself is moving. The militiamen's mistake was fatal. They were not machines of war. They were not Spartans. Hearing the relentless approach of a massive army, the Phocians fell into a blind panic. They hastily, with trembling hands, put on their heavy armor and cowardly retreated to the highest point of the hill. They prepared for their final battle, sincerely convinced that the Persian elite had come specifically for them. But the giant empire had absolutely no concern for a pathetic handful of frightened reservists. Hydarnes displayed an icy, surgical cynicism. The Persian archers simply loosed one dense hail of arrows for intimidation. Without even slowing their marching pace, the army cold-bloodedly passed them by, like ghosts dissolving into the morning mist of the descent. They easily bypassed the naive defenders of the heights and rushed straight for the naked, defenseless back of the defenders of Thermopylae. The physical sensation of the steel trap inexorably tightening became unbearable. Every crooked tree, every cold stone on this night route silently screamed of the impending global catastrophe. The great army of the East could not break the front door with a direct strike, so it silently crawled through a forgotten window. All the brilliant mathematics of King Leonidas's tactics, all the unthinkable physical suffering of his few soldiers, all the monstrous mountains of dead bodies piled in the narrow corridor, lost all strategic meaning in a single instant. This ominous night became a radical turning point for the entire military campaign. The epic clash of worldviews ended cynically with the triumph of the lowest human vices. You can train perfect fighters for decades. You can forge the deadliest blades and construct absolutely impenetrable shields. But a ruthless empire will always find that one weak man who is ready to throw open the gates for cold, hard cash. The Persians bought loyalty because they simply could not buy Spartan courage. With the first weak rays of the sun, the cold air was pierced by the desperate, breaking cry of the sentries who had fled to the Greek camp. The Spartans were still calmly and methodically cleaning their hacked bronze weapons when the terrible news fell upon them with leaden weight. Total encirclement. Words no longer had any meaning. The invisible noose, carefully tightened by the greedy hands of Ephialtes, clamped shut on the throat of the Hellenic vanguard. There was no way out. Ahead lay only an exhausting, terrible agony at the very limit of physiology. The agony at the very limit of physiology descended upon the defenders of Thermopylae even before the sun fully illuminated the cursed gorge. The morning of the third day of continuous fighting brought no saving coolness. It brought only a suffocating, sticky nightmare in which every movement of the body turned into sophisticated torture. The air had completely ceased to be transparent. It had turned into a suspension of acrid yellow dust, dried filth, and the sickening, unbearably sweet smell of rot. The mountains of uncollected bodies from the past 2 days had begun to rapidly decompose under the ruthless southern sun. To breathe this foul mist meant voluntarily letting death deep into your lungs with every breath. The conveyor belt of death, which had worked flawlessly for the first 2 days, began to suffer fatal malfunctions. The perfect Spartan machine cracked where absolutely any biological mechanism breaks. The Spartans were not immortal gods. They were ordinary people of flesh and blood, and that flesh was now literally screaming from extreme exhaustion. Their faces had turned into ghastly gray masks covered in deep furrows from sweat. Their eyes were inflamed and bloodshot from constant strain. Their lips were cracked into deep, bleeding wounds. A wild, animalistic thirst was driving them mad. Every gulp of dry, poisoned air scorched the throat like a swallow of red-hot sand. Could you hold a heavy, dented shield when your fingers are worn down to the bare bone? When your muscles are cramping from hours of static tension and there is no solid footing beneath you? The landscape of the gorge had changed irrevocably. The Greeks were forced to fight while standing on massive, pulsing heaps of the dead. The ground beneath their sandals literally bounced and gave way. One wrong move on this horrific anatomical cushion meant an immediate fall and death under the boots of the advancing enemies. This was no longer a classical ancient war with its strict rules. This was an extreme, sickening balancing act on the very edge of a biological abyss. The camera catches a close-up of an anonymous hoplite's hands for a second. The wooden shaft of his faithful ash spear
had long since shattered into splinters after hundreds of blows against enemy bronze. Clutched in his death-grip fingers is only a short, useless fragment. His knuckles are smashed. The skin on his palms is torn away, turned into a continuous open wound. He breathes heavily, greedily catching the dusty air with his mouth. Every lifting of his deformed, hacked shield requires a monstrous, superhuman effort of will. Equipment failure had become a mass phenomenon. Bronze greaves bit painfully into inflamed calves, cutting off circulation. Heavy helmets, heated by the scorching sun, had turned into red-hot ovens, cooking the mind alive. To remove the helmet meant taking a fatal blow to the face. To leave it on meant slowly going insane from heat stroke. A hard choice with no right answer. He stays on his feet solely due to a primal strength of spirit.
Physiology had long ago ordered him to surrender. The law commanded him to stand. And he stands. Strike! Pause. Strike! By noon, on the third day of relentless slaughter, the weapons had finally lost their edge. Swords had grown dull, reduced to heavy, useless hunks of iron. Bronze blades no longer cut, they shattered bone with blunt, crushing force. Blows were no longer struck for the sake of a triumphant victory. They were dealt simply to delay the inevitable for one more second. The horror of the moment lay in its absolute hopelessness. Freedom, bought at the cost of hands worn to the bone, forever loses its romantic luster. The Greeks knew damn well that the Grim Reaper wasn't just breathing down their necks anymore. He had his icy grip around their shoulders. The Persians kept coming in endless, bottomless waves. Their faceless mass seemed inexhaustible. The empire did not count its losses. The Eastern bureaucratic machine processed thousands of men per hour just to wear the defenders down physically. And that cynical calculation was starting to pay off. The phalanx was buckling. The perfectly straight line of shields began to warp under the monstrous pressure. Holding back this steel juggernaut was becoming an impossible task. The Spartans retreated step by step, leaving their last drops of strength on the stones. The hell of non-stop combat, pushed far beyond the limits of the human body, was turning the greatest warriors of antiquity into exhausted ghosts. But even in this state, they kept working. Mechanically, without emotion, driven by pure instinct, hammered into their subconscious by years of brutal drilling. Who was showing more cruelty here? The Eastern despot, cold-bloodedly sending men to certain death to satisfy a bloated ego, or the Spartan commander, demanding the impossible from his soldiers, forcing them to keep killing even when their bodies were effectively dead? Death knows no fatigue, but the doomed made him choke on his own routine. The grueling standoff reached its breaking point. Every second of combat burned through the last reserves of will. And at that exact moment, when physical strength had completely evaporated, when exhausted minds teetered on the thin edge of a merciful madness, the final word reached the king. The invisible noose of betrayal, tightened the night before, snapped shut. The worst fears were confirmed. The pass had lost its strategic value. The encirclement was complete, and the heavens crashed down on the defenders' shoulders, forcing Leonidas to make the hardest, most fatal choice of his life. The news of the final, irreversible encirclement hit the Greek camp not with a roar of thunder, but with a chilling, suffocating silence. Scouts, gasping for air and gripped by primal panic, brought word that instantly nullified all the blood spilled over the last 2 days. The pass at the hot gates had just lost every shred of strategic meaning. Geography, once their loyal ally and unbreakable stone shield, had been turned into a sealed, silent tomb by a traitor's hand. The perfect math of defensive combat was ground to dust. The Empire's steel juggernaut was now closing in from both sides. The enemy was right at their backs. It was pure, absolute checkmate. At this critical moment, when animal panic threatened to tear the remains of the Allied army apart from the inside, King Leonidas made the hardest decision of his life. He did it with striking cold-bloodedness, without a shadow of a doubt, without a tremor in his voice, and without any theatrical gestures. He issued a hard order to disband all Allied contingents. Why burn precious human resources when the finale was already mathematically certain? This wasn't an act of grand humanism or sentimental sacrifice. It was the icy, cynical calculation of a professional military commander. A fractured Greece would desperately need these armed men for the massive wars to come. Dead men can't defend the Isthmus of Corinth. Dead men don't build warships. Leonidas dryly ordered them to leave, saving their lives for future pragmatic use. But the Spartans themselves stayed on their blood-soaked ground, 300 heavy infantry, and with them, defying all logic of survival, a handful of heroes from other cities remained, 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans, whose names would be nearly swallowed by the blinding glare of the Spartan myth. They stayed in that boiling, stinking cauldron voluntarily, accepting their guaranteed death with icy calm. What makes a sane man stay in the epicenter of ultimate destruction when the door to safety is wide open? For a Spartan officer, the answer is terrifyingly simple, like an unalterable line of code. The law. The supreme, absolute law of their hyper-militarized society had no retreat option. Never. Under no circumstances. This wasn't the hysteria of fanatical martyrs seeking cheap glory in drinking songs. It was the routine, automated execution of duty. They were conceived, born, and bred to be the state's perfect, reliable tools, and now the state demanded its best tool break while dealing maximum damage to the enemy. Could you look your brothers in arms in the eye, knowing that in a few short hours you'd all be mutilated, lifeless meat, and never look away? Does patriotism justify such a cold-blooded, planned mass suicide? Who are these men standing among rotting corpses, the greatest heroes of Western civilization, or just victims of a brutal totalitarian sect that stripped them of their free will? The atmosphere in the camp of the doomed grew unbearably thick, almost tactile. No tearful goodbyes, no letters home. The Allies hurried away, hiding eyes full of burning shame and unspeakable relief, vanishing into the pale morning mist. Those who remained sank into a stoic, bone-chilling calm. It was an absolute, chemically pure brotherhood of men who had already crossed their names off the list of the living. The air hummed with internal tension. Silently, methodically, they checked their broken, dull weapons. With practiced motions, they adjusted battered, deformed armor over wounded bodies. The heavy silence before the final plunge into the abyss pressed on their eardrums harder than the roar of Xerxes' 100,000-man army. The Spartans were no longer bound by the need to conserve energy. They didn't need to hold a tight defense or calculate every thrust. Survival strategy was obsolete. Positional tactics were dead. Persian commanders, expecting a bloodless mop-up of the Greek remnants, smugly ordered the final, triumphant assault. They expected to finish off exhausted, terrified men hiding behind broken bronze shields. But what waited for the Eastern infantry in that narrowing stone passage would rewrite the Empire's understanding of human fury. The perfect geometry of the invincible phalanx broke apart.
The silence of the doomed shattered as the dead men took their final, fatal step toward the advancing enemy. That fatal step didn't just break the shield wall. It broke the back of ancient military tactics forever. It was the peak of absolute, uncontrolled madness. Casting aside their calculated defensive formation, the Spartans and their few allies surged into the open. They left the safety of the narrow passage for the wider mouth of the pass, intentionally exposing their flanks to killing blows. Survival was off the table. A total, uncompromising, suicidal slaughter began. Spears no longer struck in rhythm. The Greek phalanx no longer functioned as a single organism. It shattered into 300 autonomous, crazed predators backed into a corner. Wooden shafts splintered instantly against Persian heavy armor. The Greeks drew their short, broad swords. When the blades dulled against metal and bone, becoming useless strips of iron, they dealt fatal trauma with the heavy edges of their mangled shields. The air grew thick with the smell of oxidized bronze and sticky animal fear. For a moment, the camera shifts to a Persian archer from the fresh reserves. Your hands shake with primal terror, refusing to draw the string. You expected broken men begging for mercy. Instead, an unthinkable force is charging at you, tearing through your comrades' ranks. It's a living mass of pure, concentrated rage. His sword is broken, his shield is split, but he lunges at you, fingers digging into your throat, using his teeth as a final weapon in this savage melee. You realize with chilling horror that you can't kill this idea with steel. It will drag you into the dark with it. What was this? The ultimate manifestation of the human spirit, or a psychological regression into rabid animals? Who is the real barbarian? The Eastern soldier blindly following his liege, or the Greek fanatic turning himself into a weapon of destruction just because his state said so? Does an abstract law justify this descent into primal savagery? In the heart of this chthonic chaos, amid the thick yellow dust and wet thuds of impact, something happened that changed history. The king fell. Leonidas's death wasn't majestic. There were no grand dying speeches in the arms of weeping comrades. In this claustrophobic, apocalyptic meat grinder, there was no time for honor or mourning. A blind, random strike in the suffocating crowd ended the life of the man who built this grand trap. For the Persian overseers, it was the signal for victory. For the surviving Spartans, it was the trigger for a death-throw ecstasy. The battle lost its last shred of tactical meaning and devolved into a brutal, animalistic hand-to-hand struggle. The epicenter of this hurricane of violence was the fallen king's body. The Persians fought desperately to take Leonidas's body as the ultimate trophy for their master. The god-king hungered to publicly desecrate the remains of the man who had humiliated his empire. But the Spartan dead men walking launched a suicidal counterattack. They reclaimed their leader's body not once, not twice, but 4 times. They fought with bare hands, worn to the bone. They used fists, heavy stones, and their own broken bodies as projectiles. Controlling a dead piece of flesh became more important than their own beating hearts. The math of defense was gone, replaced by the biology of hate. The strength of the doomed lions ebbed with every agonizing second. Of the 300, only a handful of ghosts remained standing. Struggling to carry Leonidas's mangled body, snarling at every lunge, they retreated step by step to a small hill in the center of the pass. The ring of heavy imperial infantry snapped shut around the mound. The Spartans were cornered on their last patch of blood-soaked earth. And in that moment, the stunned East realized a terrifying truth. Even now, with nothing but bare hands, you couldn't get close to them. The terror of these demons was stronger than the god king's orders. An ominous pause hung over the pass before the sky finally fell. An ominous pause hung over the blood-soaked pass. The invincible army of the East, which had conquered half the known world, froze in primal shock before a handful of wounded men barely standing on a hill. The god king's direct order to charge shattered against an invisible, unbreakable wall of animal terror. The Persian infantry, elites and regulars alike, flatly refused to go near these living dead. The psychological collapse of a giant empire happened right there, in that stinking, corpse-strewn mud. What does the Lord of Asia feel when he realizes his massive terror machine is paralyzed by a few dozen broken Greeks? It was a moment of absolute imperial humiliation. Xerxes then made a decision that stripped this victory of any nobility. He ordered the remaining defenders shot from a distance, coldly, remotely, without a single chance for honorable contact.
Thousands of arrows took to the sky at once. There were so many, they literally blotted out the sun. The Spartan promise, to fight in the shade, was fulfilled by the Persians with ruthless precision. This wasn't a battle of warriors. It was a cowardly, bureaucratic disposal. A humming swarm of iron slammed into the hill. The whistle of falling arrows drowned out the death rattles. The Spartans didn't run. They didn't beg. They stood silently under the iron rain until the last man fell, covering Leonidas's mangled remains with his own body. Archaeologists who excavated this hill millennia later found it literally packed with rusted Persian arrowheads. That's not a poetic metaphor. It's a documented fact. Lead-heavy proof of the panic that forced the Eastern killing machine to keep its distance. A dull, pulsing silence fell over the hot gates. The wind blew yellow dust over broken bronze shields. The death belt finally stopped. But at what cost? The Empire paid a monstrous price for this useless rocky pass. 20,000 of its best soldiers. 20,000 elite shock troops, guardsmen, and officers left to rot in this pass. This wasn't a conqueror's triumph. It was a catastrophic, sickening Pyrrhic victory. Xerxes tried to hide the scale of the disaster. He ordered most of his dead buried in secret before his sailors could reach the site. It was a pathetic, cynical attempt to mask a total failure. The bureaucracy tried to erase the casualty counts, but the stench of 20,000 rotting bodies couldn't be washed away. The illusion of invincibility was gone forever. The physical destruction of this tiny handful of men was the East's greatest strategic blunder. The Spartans lost the battle of the flesh, but won the war of ideas. Their dead bodies, right before the eyes of the shocked enemy, began to turn into something far more terrifying. They became a violent, destructive symbol. That symbol spread like wildfire across a fractured Greece. The paralyzing fear that gripped the Greek city-states was instantly replaced by a burning, uncontrollable rage. Political infighting was ground to dust by the realization of what this ideology of total sacrifice could do. Thermopylae became the mental epicenter that united Europe. Leonidas's blood cemented the divided Greek world into a single, fanatical fist for the final reckoning. Who was the greater slave in the end? The Persian legionnaires driven to slaughter by whips, or the free Spartans who voluntarily chained their minds to a brutal state law that stripped them of their right to live? Does patriotism justify such a calculated suicide, even if it saves a continent? For centuries, the empire built massive fleets and bridges to bring slavery to every home, while the Spartans simply built a wall of their own bodies to hold on to freedom. The Persians tried to buy peace with coin, but they tripped over men who proved that an absolute idea cannot be killed, not even by arrows that blot out the sun.